Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling a massive story, a real historical puzzle, the fall of the incredible Mughal Empire. Let's dive right in.
Okay, so picture this. You've got one of the wealthiest, most powerful empires on the entire planet, a true global superpower. And then, poof. In just a few decades, it basically crumbles into dust. How does that even happen? How does something that looks totally invincible just fall apart? Well, that's the big question we're digging into.
Right, so to really feel the impact of this, you have to understand just how powerful they were. At their peak, the Mughals seemed completely untouchable. But, even as they were at their most glittering and powerful, the foundations were already starting to crack.
Now, whenever you talk about the end of the Mughals, there's one name that always comes up: Emperor Aurangzeb. The simple version of the story basically paints him as the big villain who wrecked everything. But is it really that simple? Of course not. History is never that clean-cut. The real story is way more complicated and, frankly, a lot more fascinating.
So let's really get into this. Let's look at this guy at the center of it all. Was he this evil genius who brought it all down? Or was he just a ruler dealt a really bad hand, trying to keep a sinking ship afloat? To figure that out, we have to look at what he walked into.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. On one side, you have the popular story, right? Aurangzeb, the religious fanatic, the guy who destroyed it all. But then you look at the other side, the economic reality, and it tells a completely different story. See, his father, Shah Jahan, the guy who built the Taj Mahal, well, he spent a ton of money, an incredible amount. Add to that decades of these super expensive, draining wars in the Deccan region, and you start to see the picture. Aurangzeb didn't inherit a booming empire. He inherited a financial mess.
So, to really get why this financial crisis was so deadly, we've got to pop the hood and look at the empire's engine room. We need to understand the administrative system that made the whole thing run. Now, it sounds a little complicated, I know, but trust me, once you wrap your head around this, the whole collapse suddenly clicks into place.
So the absolute core of the Mughal state was this thing called the Mansabdari system. Think of it like this. Forget European titles like Duke or Earl. The Mughals were all about numbers. Every single official in the empire, from a top general to a court poet, had a rank, a mansab. And that number told you everything about who they were and where they stood.
And here's how that system broke down. It had two key parts. First, you had the Zat rank. This was your personal number. It determined your status and, crucially, your salary. The bigger the number, the more important you are. Simple. Then, you had the Sawar rank. This was your military number. It told you exactly how many armed horsemen, or cavalrymen, you had to provide for the imperial army. So, a really powerful noble would have a high Zat and a high Sawar rank.
Okay, so you've got all these officials with ranks. How do you pay them? Well, the Mughals had a clever system. All the land in the empire was basically split into two categories. First, you had Khalisa land. This was the prime real estate, the most fertile land, and all the tax money from it went straight into the emperor's personal treasury. But all the other land was called Paibaki, and it was carved up into assignments called jagirs. So, instead of getting a paycheck, an official got a jagir. The taxes from that piece of land were his salary. A pretty slick system, right? As long as you have enough land to give out, that is.
All right, so Aurangzeb sees the treasury is basically empty, and he knows he has to do something. He comes up with what seem like totally logical solutions. But, and this is the tragic part, those very solutions set off a disastrous chain reaction that would end up ripping the whole system apart.
And you really have to remember the pressure he was under. This wasn't some random policy change. The empire was hemorrhaging cash. He was backed into a corner and had to make some really tough, drastic choices to try and stop the bleeding.
So what was his first big idea? Simple. Get more cash flowing directly to the government. And he did this by taking a bunch of that Paibaki land, the land meant for official salaries, and converting it into Khalisa, crown land. And hey, it worked. More money for the treasury. But the side effect? It was catastrophic. All of a sudden, the amount of land available for those jagirs just shrank. You now had way more officials than you had land grants to pay them with. This kicked off what historians now call the Jagirdari crisis. It was this chaotic, desperate scramble for land that basically gummed up the entire works of the government.
Okay, his second plan was also pretty straightforward. Just raise taxes. He hiked them up on the peasants from about 33% of what they grew to a whopping 50%. Now, maybe in a good year that would have been fine, but his timing was just awful. It was incredibly bad luck. This tax hike happened to line up with a string of El Niño years, which caused massive droughts. So you have peasants who are already struggling to grow anything suddenly hit with this huge tax bill. They just couldn't pay. They were pushed completely over the edge, and they started revolting, all across the empire.
And this is where things get really fascinating, because it forces us to look at some of his most controversial policies in a new light. You know, the things he's most famous for? Reintroducing the jizya tax on non-Muslims. Well, guess what? That brought in a huge amount of money. Banning court musicians, getting rid of artists, that was a massive budget cut. So while his personal religious beliefs were no doubt a part of it, you can see a cold, hard economic logic behind a lot of these moves. They weren't just about ideology. They're about desperation.
So at this point, the empire is basically a hollow shell. It's being eaten away from the inside by this administrative chaos and all these peasant revolts. It's become weak, fragile, and vulnerable. And that's exactly when the punches start coming from the outside.
Once Aurangzeb dies in 1707, things just go into a nosedive. You get a series of weak rulers who just can't handle the mess. Then, in 1717, a desperate emperor gives the British these huge trade advantages. A few decades later, in 1739, the Persian ruler Nader Shah just walks in, sacks the capital city of Delhi, and carries off a mind-boggling amount of treasure. But the final nail in the coffin? That comes in 1764 at the Battle of Buxar. The Mughal emperor is defeated, and he effectively signs over control of his richest lands to the British East India Company. It's pretty much game over.
So you see, it was just the perfect storm of disaster. Internally, you had these new regional powers, like the Marathas and the Sikhs, just tearing pieces of the empire away. Aurangzeb's policies had alienated their most important allies, the Rajputs. Then, from the outside, you had these foreign invasions that just drained what little wealth was left. And to top it all off, you had a string of emperors who were just not equipped to deal with any of it.
So when you put all of these pieces together, the picture of the collapse becomes, well, tragically clear. This wasn't just about one empire falling, this was the end of a whole era for the Indian subcontinent.
So what's the big takeaway here? Was it all Aurangzeb's fault? No, he didn't single-handedly destroy the Mughal Empire. The real story is that it was a systemic failure. The very engine that made the empire run, its administration, its economy, it broke down. And his policies, which were meant to be solutions, actually just threw gasoline on the fire, speeding up the collapse and leaving the empire too weak to survive the hits that came next. And think about it. The collapse of something so huge, so powerful, it left this massive power vacuum right in the middle of the Indian subcontinent. Nature abhors a vacuum, right? Something had to fill that space. And that leads us to the final crucial question. Who was going to step in and take over?